Welcome to the adult class. We are studying the book of Revelation. Last week we stopped at Revelation chapter 2, verse 9. Actually, we had began a little bit of discussion concerning verse 9, but that's where we ended when we were discussing verse 9. It pertains to the church at Smyrna. For the context, I want to go back to verse 8 and go ahead and read through verse 11 about the church of Smyrna, and then we'll begin at verse 9 in our discussion. Revelation chapter 2, verse 8 beginning. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Okay, last week we introduced the church at Smyrna. I won't go back through those things. We've already done that in verse 8. Verse 9 we did begin discussing. We talked about where Jesus said, I know thy works. We said nothing could be hid from him. It always begins this way. I know thy works. Tribulation, the word tribulation comes from a Greek word that means pressure. That the church was receiving a great deal of pressure. And you can take that and however you want. In other words, it was a tremendous amount of trials and difficulties being placed upon the church there. And he says, I know the pressure you're under. He says, in the poverty. Although the church of the first century, this particular area was not really poor, but yet these Christians were. And I gave you some reasons why this may have been the case. The persecutions, the taking of homes, businesses, not employing people who were Jews, this kind of thing, or not, I'm sorry, Jews, but Christians. All those would have led to a great deal of poverty in the day. But yet the parenthetical statement there, the parentheses, but thou art rich. While they were poor physically, while they were poor and suffering physically, he says, but you're really rich. And so much of this has to do with an attitude. Now, they were rich in what? Well, they were rich in Christianity. They were rich in their faith. They had the faith, the convictions that Jesus was the Christ. And in that sense, Jesus says, but you're really rich. And we discussed this somewhat last week. I won't go into a great deal more unless you desire to. But so much of it had to do with a mindset of physically they were very poor, but success is not measured in dollars and cents. Success is not measured in the food that I eat. Success is not measured in the clothing that I wear. Success is about being right with my God. Michael?
And also in that, for us to keep in mind as well, is rich in our inheritance if we're faithful children of God. There's no greater riches, earthly riches can't even compare.
That's true. And I do think that's the idea that's being presented here.
Success is a journey, not a destination.
Good way of thinking, Tom. All right. Good. Any other comments? Okay. Since I did discuss this somewhat last week, this part of it, and then he goes on to say, And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Christianity was first presented to the Jews, Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. They were, when Jesus came to this earth, he said, I came not to the Gentiles, and he even told his disciples in Matthew chapter 10, the limited commission, don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the city of Samaria, go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay? The Jews had been taught under the Mosaic law, and that was the target at first. Convert these people, turn from your sin. And now here we are, the churches began, the Great Commission was for all the world. Jew, Gentile, male, female, bond, so everyone. But yet, Jesus says that there were blasphemy of them which say they are Jews. There were, as I understand it, a great deal of Jews in the city here, and many claim to be of a Jewish heritage or what have you, but according to Jesus, they say that, but they are not. They are the synagogue of Satan. In other words, instead of doing my will, speaking of Jesus, instead of doing the will of Christ, they were actually bringing destructive force into things that they were teaching. Romans chapter 2, verse 28 through 29. I'll read this to you. You can turn and read it yourself if you'd like. Romans 2, verse 28 and 29. There, Paul answers just who is a Jew in today's terms, or in spiritual terms. Here's what it says. For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. Are we Jews spiritually as Christians? Yes. Yes, we are. And well, it is related and it's not related, but I'm going to say it anyway. I hear many people talking about, of course, we all know that Israel in the Middle East, the nation, physical nation of Israel, they are at war with Hamas, which it makes sense to me the way Hamas, treated them in early October. But I hear people say, we as America, we must be the ally of the nation of Israel because they're Jews, because of what the Bible says, that they are God's chosen people. Today, who is a Jew? Spiritual Jew. We are that nation of Israel. Not this physical, literal nation over in the Middle East. All right? And I think we need to make that distinction. I think it's odd that most, I would never say all, I don't know all the people there, but most of those who hold the Jewish faith at least, they still don't believe that Jesus is the Christ. They're still waiting on, I suppose, Messiah to come, who's literally, physically, I guess, is going to set them free. I don't know. But they rejected the Christ. It was the Jews who had Jesus crucified. But nevertheless, it certainly is a misconception when people take verses from the Old Testament and in other places and say, hey, we've got to be on the Jew side because that's God's people. Oh, we are God's people. We are spiritual Israel. And I'm not saying that we ought to be opposed to the nation over there in the Middle East. I'm saying that's not what the Scripture is talking about. We are spiritual Israel.
That's Romans 8, what?
Oh, that was Romans 2, verse 28 and 29, Ronnie. Romans 2, 28 and 29. All right, any thoughts about that? All right. He said, I know the blasphemy of those which say they're Jews. They are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. As I said, and they may have been physical descendants from Abraham. They may have been of the Jewish lineage, but they were certainly causing problems in the church here. All right, verse 10. What a powerful passage and what a tribute to the folks at Smyrna. He says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried. And you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. There's no suggestion here, you might suffer. No. No, Jesus very clearly said you're going to. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Some of you shall be put in prison. And even in the very face of death itself, he said, you be faithful. The first word of this passage has a great deal of meaning to all the rest in the verse. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Why did he tell them not to fear? Don't be afraid.
The outcome, ultimately, we're victims.
Yes.
It's a scary situation too, but, speaking from my perspective, what these people might be undergoing, I think they would be fearful what's about to happen to them. But as the end result, nothing.
Physically, I think fear would be a natural inclination for them and us as well, if we were there. And we knew that, the civil governments were banging on our doors, taking our neighbors. Well, they just took Larry Whitehead off, and now he's in jail. And what about, I may be next, and how are they going to treat us? And they're beating people. Some are even reportedly put to death. Would that not bring a state of physical apprehension to all of us? I think it would, if we'd be honest. Okay? There's not many macho men and women say, yeah, I want to go. Oh, I don't think that's the idea. Typically, it would have brought fear and apprehension to people. But yet, Jesus says, and I think he nailed this when he says, don't worry about those physical things. Well, I've never set foot in a jail before. Well, I have. I've visited people that's been in jail back when I preached full time and otherwise. But I guarantee you there's ladies in this congregation that's never stepped foot in a jail. Well, there's bad people in there. Why that? And it just kind of brings fear to, or apprehension, I'll say that. And again, not just that, but to think how they would be persecuted and some even put to death. But he says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Is there anyone in the church at Smyrna that's alive today? Not a trick question. No, they're all dead. And my point in saying that is, as calloused as it may be, is there anyone here that's going to live physically forever? No, we're all going to die. We're all going to leave this world. And we don't know what their future beholds or holds for us. But yet here Jesus says, don't fear those things. Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. If you want to turn there, you can. Again, I'll read it. The text reads, Jesus speaking, and fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. But rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So there was Jesus says, don't fear man. Jesus isn't saying that they won't put you in prison. No, they will. Some would. Some of the folks at Smyrna would be going. He even says there in verse 10, and they shall cast some of you into prison, and you may be tried. You're going to suffer, he says. Shall suffer. But yet he says, don't worry about that. And again, look at the end. Whose side am I on? I am right in this. And he tells them, have courage, have faith. We're all going to leave this world. You have faith in me. Don't fear those things. Howard Winters, I've never read this except his work. I'm not sure where he picked this up. It's in his commentary. But if I can find it here. Here. Right in front of me. He wrote this. It said that Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, was once enraged at 40 Christian men because they would not bow down and worship his image. He commanded, strip them to the skin. After they were stripped, he ordered them to stand on a frozen lake until they were ready to renounce the Nazarene God. But when dawn broke the next morning, 40 nude men were found dead on the ice. They had been faithful unto death. That very well may have happened. Again, this is the only place I've read it from his commentary, or his works. But, again, Jesus says, don't be afraid. I'm going to be with you. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison. Do you envision that being a man with a forked tongue and a pitchfork and a forked tail? That's what it is. I mean, do you imagine this red being, he's the one that put them in prison? No, who did? His workers. Go ahead.
We're Satan. If we allow ourselves to be controlled by Satan, then we are sons of the devil. We're Satan. Peter disciple of Christ, he was taught to put it behind himself. You know, so it depends on how it happens, whether you're, and man, it's representative.
Yeah. So he's not talking about the devil literally being there. I think he's those who are working for Satan, those who are doing Satan's bidding at the time. Men are going to put you into prison, but they're doing the will of Satan. All right? And then he says this, another, we get so much out of this word if we look it up and define it, that ye may be tried. What is the word tried? What's the definition? Do you know? I'm going to see if I can look that up. Pardon? Yes, and that's exactly what it means. Thayer, I never did get to the, I was clicking on it there and it didn't come up immediately, but Mary's exactly right. It's a test. It's a trial. Do we realize that many things in life that may come upon us may be a trial for us to test, to see how genuine we really are? He said, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ronnie.
You're talking about them 40 men out there. As verse talking about Jesus was made to be sin for us. It's a comparison. They made him to show his nudity on the cross. And it wasn't by choice. There it is. And nudity is how they done it.
So, yeah, they stripped him from all clothing to be the most uncomfortable that they could, and of course it killed him.
To do what you're talking about.
Yeah.
To get him to
Hey,
throw God off.
trials and tribulations in this life should bring us closer to God, because it shows us that we need God more in our life than what we think we do.
Well, yeah. And he says, some of you shall be cast into prison that ye may be tried, that you may be tested. Is your faith genuine? Is it real? I don't know that if you were there at the people at church in Smyrna and you were suffering because of Christianity, you were being put into prison, would you think immediately that, hey, I'm being tested? I'm being examined to see if I'm genuine? Will my faith fail? But that's exactly what Jesus says. This is a trial. It is a test. And we must be victorious in that. He says that ye may be tried. You're going to be tested. And ye shall have tribulation 10 days. The word tribulation there, same as in verse 9, it's the same Greek word. It means you're going to have a great deal of pressure for this, the tribulation 10 days. And if I interpret this correctly from the commentaries I've read, plus it makes sense in the context, what Jesus is saying, this is for a brief time. It's not going to be forever. This is not, well, it's my fate and my children's fate and my grandchildren's fate if they're Christians and my great. No, this is for a brief time. It's not going to last forever. You hang in there. Even physically, realize this isn't going to be, something that future generations are going to have to deal with in this same manner. And again, why was the book of Revelation written? Oh, it was written for us yet in the future. No, it was written for them. He's telling these folks at Smyrna, he said, you hang in there. It's only going to be for a brief time. This isn't always going to be the case. It's going to be, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. It's a limited time. And then he says, be thou faithful unto death. And I think the meaning there is, be thou faithful even in the face of death. We have had members die here, and we'll have more. That's just the fact, it's just nature. And it hurts, to see someone that you've known and loved, you appreciate, you've been with so long, and then to see them leave this world. What if they were put to death? But he says, you be faithful even in the face of death, and I'll give thee a crown of life. There are rewards, and as Bobby said at the very beginning, look beyond this physical life. We're all going to die. Why not be faithful even in the face of death is the idea there. All right, and then of course the reward, I'll give unto thee a crown of life. Any thoughts or comments before we go further?
I guess it's also showing important, and it's encouraging to establish your faith, examine your faith. You'll
or I think we got a question, maybe are we really in the faith? 2 Timothy 3:12, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. There will be times, as Bob correctly said, darkness hates light. And spiritually that is the case. But may we never forget the end part here, I will give thee a crown of life. Paul says, I fought a good fight, I finished the course, I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there's a crown of righteousness laid up for me. I've lived as I ought, I've fought this fight, I've wrestled this era, I'm now ready to be killed, I'm ready to be offered. There's a crown of righteousness up there for me. We will have a reward in the end. All right. Any other thoughts about verse 10 before we go to verse 11? He's concluding the statements about the church at Smyrna. And he says in verse 11, he that hath an ear, let him hear. And you'll hear that time and again. And when we look at these churches, and we've already addressed what that is. Not that some didn't have physical ears. No, those that have the ability to listen, those that will listen. Let him hear what the Spirit saith in the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. To overcome is what this book of Revelation is all about. To overcome. And that's why it's so prevalent for us today. That's why it's a book that's not written just, oh, it's about those people back there, and it has nothing to do with us. Well, it does have something to do with us in the sense we learn from these things. He that overcometh. I can overcome Satan. I can overcome the trials and difficulties of life. I can be victorious. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now that's a new one. New in our study, at least this part of the book of Revelation. The second death. The concept of the second death occurs 3 or 4 times in the book of Revelation. This is the first time. Before we actually look at some scriptures here, any idea what the second death is?
Hell.
Pardon?
Hell.
Yes. The first death. We're all going to die. But not all will go through the second death. Let me explain. Let me just read another verse and it explains it for us here, instead of me doing that. I don't know why I'm having trouble with this. Turn to the book of Revelation chapter 20. Let's do 21:8. Let's do that. Revelation 21:8. And we'll look at all 3 of them, but Revelation 21:8. But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So he's talking about those individuals who are unrighteous, maybe never obeyed the gospel, maybe you're not Christians. Well, obviously those are not Christians. But those even who are Christians who have been involved in the sins he just mentioned there, he said they're going to have their part in the lake of fire and brimstone. It's the second death. And that's the death we don't want. Not a man or woman living is exempt from father time and the ultimate physical death we all shall suffer. Hebrews 9:27. As it is appointed unto man once to die. We're all going to die physically. But the second death is what we don't want. And the second death, I do believe, will be pronounced at the day of judgment. And there, my soul, if found lacking, if not righteous, I will die that second time in a terrible manner, never to come back. And he describes it here.
You know, death means separation.
Yes.
The thought of being separated from the Creator, which is life, and being cast into outer darkness for every eternity is torment, is destruction. I mean, you think about it. We know that literal fire can't burn the soul, it can't burn the spiritual creature, but this record is destruction and what it's going to be like. Again, to die is to be separated from our Creator.
Yeah.
For eternity. And that's something that we should come for.
And Bob, I think that's when Jesus, when he walked on this earth and he warned people of hell, this punishment, he said, would be cast into outer darkness. 1 Thessalonians, or is it 2 Thessalonians, chapter 1, he talks about who will be separated from God. And again, that's what the second death is. Death comes from the Greek word thanatos, and Bob is right. It means death in the Greek means a separation. In my estimation, we are so in tune with the glories of God all around us, even though we may not view the world out here in which we live being this environment that God gave humanity. It has His fingerprints all over it. In other words, I think we should enjoy physical life. I don't think it was meant to be, dreadful, and there's certainly sickness, disease, and even death, which remind us this world's not our home. But I don't think He created this world in such a way that would make our lives miserable. But yet, it is, just as He made man and all of animal, all of the plant kingdom, etc., it was written in His glory. But to be separated from all that is truly to be from an outer darkness, away from everything we know about God, the glories of God. I can't describe. I can't even fathom, but I do believe that's what it means here. I am separated from that. And yes, obviously there's going to be punishment there. Bob said something which I agree with again. And he says a literal soul, how is it affected by literal fire? Well, why use these terms like fire and brimstone? Is there any pain more adverse than a burn? I know it heals, but I'm talking about at the time to be. I've never had a third-degree burn. Some of you may have. I don't know. Okay, it's a terrible feeling, terrible thought. I remember Darrell, my older brother, when we were young. He was 2 years older than I, but just when we were camping. With camping, it was, probably 30 yards from the house, but we were cooking something, potatoes or something. I don't know, grease. And of course, I don't know how it happened, but children's children. But he got his pant leg on fire, and it burned just above his ankle. It was just melted. Ew. And I remember just as a child having the agony that he went through for a long time over that. But I think that's why it's fire and it's brimstone. In our minds, that which gives the ultimate pain, punishment. And, don't live that way. That is the second death, a death of which we will never overcome. We don't want to die that way.
David, I don't think we fully understand how terrible it's going to be. And I know it's controversial to say that Jesus, when He died, in Garden of Gethsemane, He sweat as it were drops of blood. Jesus wasn't fearing physical death. He's telling you, stop, don't fear. Jesus wasn't fearing that. I don't think that's what brought, as it were, drops of blood. He tasted the second death for us and got the cross. And again, it's controversial in the brotherhood, but personally, I feel that Jesus was separated from God for a short period of time. And if you think about that and contemplate that in Jesus' mind in the Garden of Gethsemane, that should demonstrate just how horrible it should be. You can feel so much the way you would sweat as it would drop of blood to be separated from the Creator for all the time. He knows only it was a temporary time. Still, just to be separated was something that bring that kind of agony and that kind of I don't want to say fear, but that kind of experience of it to be separate from the Creator.
I'm not the ultimate exegesis by that fancy word. I'm not the ultimate one who interprets the Scripture for sure. And yes, what Bob said is controversial somewhat. There are some in the Brotherhood who think that's nonsense, or I personally agree with that. I don't know why else would there be. Why would Jesus, did he so dread knowing that they were going to slap him and hit him? Did he so dread having those spikes, which I believe he knew would happen, driven through his hands and feet? Well, no one would look forward to that, okay? That's morbid to think otherwise. But I don't think that's what his fear was. I don't think, and I say fear, maybe it wasn't fear, that's the wrong word to use, but the agony which Matthew chapter 26 clearly describes. As he went to the disciples, could you not watch with me? Just this brief time, pray that you enter not into temptation. He goes to them and they're already asleep. But in those times when he's, Father, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. And it did talk about, I think it's Luke's account that talks about the sweat fell from his brow as if it were drops of blood. It was that intense. And then when Jesus was on the cross, when he died, there was darkness on the earth, a period of time. It is my belief that death being separation in that sense, as he paid for the penalty of man's sin. God cannot fellowship sin. He is righteous. Jesus was paying that price. And I'm not saying he was, he's still paying this price today, and I don't mean it that way, but for a brief time I do believe that's my thought anyway. But regardless, we're kind of going off on a different route there than I meant to. Thanks, Bob. The other place where the second death is talked about is Revelation 20 and verse 14. And it's just a chapter from where we were at earlier. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. So back in chapter 2, where we were, in verse 11, if I can get back there. He that overcometh shall not be heard of the second death. So the second death is, again, that being placed into hell, the place of ultimate punishment of mankind. That's what we don't want, is the second death. Any thoughts about the church at Smyrna before we look at the church at Pergamum?
David, you mentioned how we're all appointed to die. That's
Yeah.
something we can't change. But every one have a choice on that second death.
That's true.
We can choose to experience that second death for eternity, or we can choose to live eternity in heaven with God. And that's something we ought to be busy about sharing with people. And so many people in this world, they need that, and I'm scared that we just don't share it like we should.
I can't disagree. Yeah, that's sad. Someone once said this, and it is kind of catchy, if you think about it. He who is born once dies twice. When were we born once? Well, it varies for us all, but the day that our mothers gave birth, that's when we were born once. If we're only born once, we're going to die twice. Physical death, eternal death. He who is born twice dies once. When did we die? When were we born once? Again, when our mothers gave birth to us. The second time, Jesus says, he that is born of water and spirit. John 3, verse 3 through 5. That's the second birth. I'm born as a Christian, right? I come forth from that watery grave of baptism as a new person, a new creature in Christ, Paul said. So he that is born twice dies once, and that's physical death. Kind of catchy, but anyway. And I didn't come up with that, but I read that. It's kind of catchy. Okay, let's look at the church at Pergamum then. And we've got, if that clock's around about 5 minutes or 4 or 5 minutes, we'll introduce this anyway. Time I read the whole thing, classes will be up. Let's look at verse 12, and I'll look at some introductive remarks about it. And unto the angel in the church at Pergamos write, these things saith he which hath the sharp sword with two edges. All right, what do we know about the church at Pergamos? The church of Pergamos itself as a city was the capital of the province of Asia. It was the headquarters for emperor worship, which tells you a lot about the area and the events that are going to happen to the church. It was a place where a lot of different false religions, idols were made or kept. This I found rather interesting. A temple was built for, I can't pronounce this, Asklepios, Asclepios, the god of healing. It was the symbol of this god was a serpent. And it said that if you had health issues, you would go to the temple, and there you would place in a big, almost like a dungeon, and snakes, allow snakes to crawl all over you. Now, these snakes were not poisonous or venomous, or at least I assume they were not. But they were, anyway, if you didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother you, but they'd crawl over you and everything. And that's supposed to aid in your healing. I suppose I'd just be sick. I guess it would get the heart beating, wouldn't it? I thought that was interesting. Another thing that's interesting to me, that in Egypt is the place where most of the papyri was produced, the writing material of the early times. They would take these reeds and they would harvest them. They would split them as a reed, open them up and remove the pithy inside, the spongy middle of it. They would dry it. They would, then they would weave it much like a chair. You've seen these, I don't know what kind of chair, what they're called, but how they weave these seats. A lot of older chairs were made like that. The bottoms of them were
Cane.
wicker, cane. Okay, you know the idea. But that's principally the way they would make writing material. Then they would sand it and go through all these processes. Well, I thought this was interesting. Egypt, Alexandria, they were becoming suspicious that Pergamus was going to have a greater library of writings and of books, of scrolls, than they were. So they cut the papyrus off. We're not going to send you any more writing material. Well, interestingly enough, they then originated, parchment. And parchment, they said, well, we can't get the papyrus from Egypt, we'll make our own. Parchment was made from skins. They would take the skins of certain animals, they would dry the skins, they would put it through a lot, it was very laborious, I'm told, but it would go through these different processes. Then they would sand, once they removed all the meat and the fat off the hides, it would go through a drying process. They would sand it where it's very smooth and pliable, and then they began to use papyrus to write on. And the advantage of that is it lasted much longer than the reeds. You can imagine you roll that reed up, up and down reed it a few times, and it becomes rather fragile, where the skins lasted much longer. And many of the scrolls that we have found have been parchment. But anyway, needless information, but interesting to me. All right, our classes, some of them have already come in. That's pretty well it about the Pergamus. However, remember, it was the capital of the province of Asia, and it was the headquarters for emperor worship, which will play into this here when we begin to look at this. All right, any thoughts as we conclude? All right, next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll jump right into the meat of this and begin to see what Jesus has to say to the folks at Pergamus. Appreciate your attention.